Well, I'm glad to be here, or to be here. We have to put that in sort of air quotes, right? I'm here with you only as a two-dimensional image on a screen. Um, I'm actually in Vermont, although I think in the background photo you see behind me, I am imagining I'm also in Lake Clark National Park. So I suppose I am in three places at once with you here in Vermont, in Oklahoma, and in Lake Clark National Park. I'm also talking at a camera, and I'm hoping that you hear me. I have no idea whether you hear me or not, but I'm just going to keep talking and pretend that you do. I'm also going to share my screen with you all. And so I think you see me as well. If at any point this is not correct, one of you will have to just pop in, unmute yourselves, and tell me that you don't hear me, that my lips are moving. You can see my lips moving, or that you can't see my screen. But anyway, I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Ben, for that wonderful introduction. And hopefully maybe we could be artists in residence together sometime. That would be a great opportunity to collaborate. We could probably write some songs, and I would have to leave the poetry writing to you, however. So the title of the talk that you may have seen in your programs is Cultivating Creativity for the Christian Parent, Teacher, and Student. And I'm going to confess, or throw other people under the bus, as they say. I did not actually come up with that title, but I liked it. And I pondered that title as a sort of an invitation to what to speak about. And as I think about this word cultivating or cultivation, one of the things I think about is soil. To cultivate something, and this is, I suppose, particularly appropriate for a talk about a tree, it involves the soil in which that tree grows. To cultivate creativity involves the soil in which our creativity grows. It involves all the aspects of nurturing that growth. And that doesn't just happen, with a tree out in the middle of space, right? The tree is in an environment. Its roots are in that soil. And I think what is that soil that enables the cultivation of creativity? And what I really thought about is what that soil ultimately is the soil of community, or the soil of Christian community specifically. If we're looking at cultivating creativity for the Christian parent, teacher, and student, then we're looking at cultivating creativity in the context of Christian community. So I sort of have a subtitle of that, and those of you who have read Leaf by Niggle may recognize where the subtitle comes from. I title it The Painter and the Parish. The painter, of course, is the character Niggle in this story. Parish is Niggle's neighbor, but you may recognize that the word parish not only is a proper noun within the story, but also is a common noun. A parish is a Christian community. So it's really a wonderful story to explore the relationship between the artist and their Christian community, between the painter and the parish, as that community, as the place, the soil in which creativity can be cultivated. So I want to do a couple things in this talk. Really, at the core of it, I think the first thing I wrote was the responsibility of the Christian church or the Christian community to its artists. If you don't like the word responsibility, you could think of this in another way. What is the role of the Christian community in cultivating the creativity, or in cultivating art? What is the role of the Christian church or community? Well, we could also ask the question, well, what is the responsibility of artists to their Christian community? Not only is what is a responsibility of the community to the artist, but what is a responsibility of the artist to the community? Or again, we might ask, what is the role of the artist in cultivating or helping to bring about the soil that helps cultivate that creativity? Having said that, that's sort of the main point of this talk. It's actually only going to be about the last third of it. Because before I get there, I think it's really important to lay a foundation for why we should even care about art or about creativity or about creative art. And so the beginning of my talk is actually going to come from something I shared here at OBU maybe 3 years ago. And I want to begin with that, and I'm going to apologize to those who are here for that. But I think it's important that we have a foundation for why we should even care about art. Why should creativity matter? And this story, Leaf by Niggle, has a wonderful threefold apologia, a threefold defense for why art matters, why we should care about it. So let's jump into that story and begin with that defense of creative art, and then jump back to the artist and community. The story Leaf by Niggle begins, there was once a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go. Indeed, the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry with his preparations. Niggle was a painter. Now I'm going to risk a somewhat bold statement. Those of you who have read or studied Tolkien beyond just having read his fantasy works may know that Tolkien really expressed a low opinion of allegory. He was not a fan of allegory. Yet, despite that, there were certainly a couple times when he wrote pieces that really lend themselves to an allegorical understanding or an allegorical interpretation. Not necessarily in the strict sense of allegory of, say, A Pilgrim's Progress, but maybe in a looser definition of allegory, maybe more akin to something like C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Not only do I think Leaf by Niggle is an allegory, but it's a very specific allegory. It is an allegorical, autobiographical fairy tale. It is autobiographical in the sense that this allegory, this fairy tale, was Tolkien's vehicle really for pouring out his own deepest thoughts about himself, his own life's work as an imaginative creator, as an author. It is both an apology for his faults or his perceived faults, but also a defense for what he wanted to do, or for what he was trying to do. There's one passage a little bit later in the story, still early on in the story, just a couple pages in, if you have this in book form, that I think really makes it clear that Tolkien was writing about himself in the person of Niggle. There was one picture in particular which bothered him. It had begun with a leaf caught in the wind, and it became a tree, and the tree grew, sending out innumerable branches and thrusting out the most fantastic roots. Strange birds came and settled on the twigs and had to be attended to. Then all around the tree and behind it, through the gaps in the leaves and boughs, a country began to open out. And there were glimpses of a forest marching over the land and a mountain's tipped with snow. Niggle lost interest in his other pictures, or else he took them and tacked them onto the edges of his great picture. Soon the canvas became so large that he had to get a ladder, and he ran up and down it, putting in a touch here and rubbing out a patch there. Those of you familiar with any of the life of Tolkien, any biographical elements of him as an author, may know that this is a really wonderful description of Tolkien himself. It is a description of his whole life's work, of his Middle-earth legendarium. I think some people have read this passage and think that that the initial painting, the initial leaf caught in the wind was The Hobbit. But actually, that's not quite right. 20 years before Tolkien began writing The Hobbit, he actually began writing his Middle-earth mythologies, his Middle-earth legends and stories. And he had 2 decades worth of work telling these stories, and inspired by a character named Arundel, and inspired by his love of language and his desire to create his own languages. And when he began writing The Hobbit, he really didn't even know The Hobbit was part of his Middle-earth story. It really began as a sort of separate story, an unattached leaf. There are aspects of the story that are actually really anachronistic to Middle-earth. Hobbits and the trolls, Tom, Bert, and Bill, and even goblins don't quite fit into the Middle-earth that Tolkien had spent 20 years creating. But somewhere along the way, the Hobbit and the dwarves stumble into Rivendell, and all of a sudden Tolkien's leaf, the separate leaf, gets attached to the great painting that he spent his whole life on, and yet still wasn't done by the time he died. He still hadn't settled and hadn't finished revising and putting together all the Silmarillion stories in the final form that he wanted them to be in. So this is certainly, again, a story about Tolkien, and it is his defense. And before we get to the defense, I guess there's 3 characters that it's helpful to know about, and perhaps those of you who have read the story have thought about these characters. There is within the story, among the characters that lend themselves to some sort of a allegorical interpretation, there is this triune medical board, this medical board of 3 persons. The 2 obvious persons are known simply as the first voice and the second voice. We meet them when it says Niggle was lying in the dark, resting completely, and he hears a voice, and it seems to him to be a medical board or a court of inquiry. And the first voice is a severe voice, more severe than the doctor's. The second voice is a gentle, hopeful, sad voice. So you might think, well, there's only 2 voices, but of course, the fact that these 2 voices are connected to a sort of medical board, and then there's also a specific reference to the doctor, really would imply that the doctor himself is part of this board. And so there are really 3 characters in this medical board: the first voice, the second voice, and the doctor. And they provide a sort of divine perspective. Collectively, these 3 voices seem to represent healing, justice, and mercy brought together in a perfect unity. Again, a trinity, a divine trinity. And so these voices become 3 of the trustworthy voices for understanding ultimately what the story is about and the important points that Tolkien as an author was trying to make. So what is this threefold defense of creative art? The first value, the first purpose of creative art, I think it maybe is the most important and the most central. We glorify our creator by being who and what he created us to be. Why is art important? Why is creativity important? We glorify our creator by being who and what he created us to be. And what he created us to be was creative. The story, the second paragraph of the story begins with the statement, Niggle was a painter. And I think that's wonderful. It doesn't say that Niggle painted or that he liked to paint or that painting was something he did, but rather Niggle was a painter. That is, being a painter was his very personality. It was who he was and not merely something that he did. It was core to his personness, core to his very being. A little bit later, the second voice, this trustworthy second voice, points out he was a painter by nature. He took a great deal of pains with leaves just for their own sake. Painting was something that was worthwhile in and of itself, not something that had to have some other ulterior motives. To paint leaves well, just for their own sake, was a worthwhile endeavor, a worthwhile pursuit. That for a painter to paint is a way that that painter glorifies the one who made him to be a painter. Tolkien gets at this idea in several places. There's a moment in his essay, his wonderful essay on fairy stories, where Tolkien defends specifically the creative imagination of the writing of fantasy literature, but he's really defending all of artistic endeavor by saying we make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. This gets us really right back to Genesis 1, where the first thing we learn about God, or I would say the first verb associated with God, is the verb create. And the first thing we learn about humans is that we are made in God's image. And so if the first thing we learn about God is that God is creative, and the first thing we learn about us is that we are made in God's image, that suggests to me that one of the core things it means to be human is that we are creative. If that's who God made us to be, then I would suggest that we glorify God simply by being what and who he made us to be. We glorify our Creator by being who and what he created us to be. Is maybe the first and central defense of the value of creativity in the practice of art. One other story worth mentioning is Tolkien's story of Owlet and Yavana in the Silmarillion. Owlet is the angelic being who brings the dwarves into existence, but he can't give them free will. So he brings the dwarves into existence, but then the divine creator named Iluvatar in the Silmarillion is the one who gives the dwarves free will. And there's this wonderful dialogue between Owlet and the creator, Iluvatar. And the creator is questioning Owlet, why did you make the dwarves? Why did you do that? Since I didn't ask you to. And Owlet's defense is wonderful. He says, yet the making of things is in my heart, from my own making by thee, and a child of little understanding that makes a play of the deeds of his father may do so without thought of mockery, but because he is the son of his father. And I would say all of us are the daughters and the sons of a great creative God. Though we don't understand everything that God does, and that's of course a great understatement, the making of things is in all of our hearts because we are made by a maker. The second aspect of Tolkien's defense of creative art is that our creative art actually enriches creation. At the end of his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien writes, the Christian has still to work with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die, but he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties, and as an aside, I would say particularly our faculty for creativity, our faculty for art, have a purpose which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in creative art he may actually assist in the affoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. Our creativity enriches creation, enriches it in multiple ways. It adds beauty to the world that God has already made. And of course, it's a wonderful metaphor that Tolkien would use the word effoliation, which has an original meaning, although this meaning has changed. And in its earliest meaning of this word, it means to bring something into leaf. Our art helps leaf out the world, which is a great metaphor in a story about a tree, for a story about a tree. There's a point in the story where the painter Niggle has come upon his painting of a tree, except the painting of a tree has been given primary reality. It is no longer a painting of a tree, it is a tree itself. And when Niggle first comes and sees his tree now as a real, living, growing tree and no longer a two-dimensional painting, he says, it's a gift. He was referring to his art and also to the result, but he was using the word quite literally. In other words, this describing of the painting as a gift, Tolkien is saying, has so many levels of meaning. It was a gift to Niggle from the creator, but it's also Niggle's gift to the world, or it is the creator's gift to the world through Niggle. That our work of art, our creative art, our expressions of creativity really can enrich the world, can be God's work through us to gift to the world more beauty, more value. And third and finally, before we jump to this topic of community, and this is, I think, in some sense, the most subtle point and the easiest to misunderstand. But I would also say that art can reveal truth about the world. Art can deepen our understanding of the world. Truth can be revealed through our art. In the metaphor of the story, art can even introduce people to the mountains. The mountains in the story are the land where the great shepherd comes from. So I'm not even going to bother to elaborate on that to this audience. If you know who the great shepherd is, then you have an idea of the country where the great shepherd comes from. Those are the mountains in the metaphor of the story. And it's interesting that that this painter Niggle paints a tree, but in the background behind this tree, there was always these glimpses of the mountains. And when the tree is given primary reality, you could still look through the tree and see the mountains in the background. And it describes his painting and the reality that comes out of his painting. You could go on and have a whole country in a garden or in a picture, if you prefer to call it that. You could go on and on, but not perhaps forever. There were the mountains in the background. They did get nearer very slowly. They did not seem to belong to the picture, or only as a link to something else, a glimpse through the trees of something different, a further stage, another picture. In other words, the mountains are something not that Niggle created. Niggle created the tree. The mountains are God's kingdom, God's land. But the wonderful thing is that the tree gave a glimpse of the mountains. Niggle's art could point people to a deeper spiritual reality behind his painting. At the end of the story, the second voice, this voice of grace and gentleness, comments on this country of Niggle's, this painting that has turned into reality, and says, it is proving very useful indeed. As a holiday and a refreshment, it is splendid for convalescence. And not only for that, for many, it is the best introduction to the mountains. It works wonders in some cases. I am sending more and more there. They seldom have to come back. Niggle's art points people to the mountains, but it also heals people. Art heals. It reveals truth. It deepens our understanding. It heals. Art works in people. And I think one of the most important ways that it heals, whether we recognize it or not, is by pointing us to the deeper truths, the spiritual truths. Now, before we conclude this, it's important to make a comment about this phrase, useful. And this is where I think there is the danger. If we only looked at this third point as the value of art, and saw art only in terms of some sort of usefulness, I think we would miss out on a lot. And we would be misunderstanding Tolkien. Keep in mind when we look at this third point, that art can reveal the truth, that before we even get there, we've already said that art is valuable simply because it is an expression of creativity. It is a being of who we are meant to be. It adds beauty to the world. And so we have to see this third thing in context. And maybe the best way to see this is to look at the the uh, antagonistic character in the story. So again, as Tolkien says in multiple places, art can point us to the underlying reality or truth. But I never want to reduce art to simply some abstract meaning. Art can never be reduced to an abstract meaning. Counselor Tompkins is the sort of unsympathetic, antagonistic character in the story. And he represents what I would say is a secular view of art. I suspect, and my friend, I think my friend Jonathan Evans is the one who suggested this to me, that Tompkins is a diminutive of the name Tom or Thomas. And the Thomas of the Bible is most famous as being a doubter. And if we take that as sort of an indication, a hint in the name, this character Tompkins might represent the small-minded doubter or the small-minded unbeliever. And Tompkins actually judges Niggle's art as being worthless. He says of Niggle, I think he was a silly man, no use to society at all. To which another character, Atkins, says, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, it depends what you mean by use. And then Tompkins goes on, no practical or economic use. I dare say he could have been made into a serviceable cog if you schoolmasters know your business, but you don't, and so we get useless people of his sort, right? This unsympathetic character of Tompkins refers to artists as useless people. And I would say, by the way, that's a pretty common view in our culture today. Tompkins goes on and says, if I ran this country, I should put him and his like to some job that they're fit for, washing dishes in a communal kitchen or something. And I should see that they did it properly, or I would put them away. And I should have put him away long ago. Of course, painting has uses, but you couldn't make use of his painting. There is plenty of scope for bold young men not afraid of new ideas and new methods, none for this old-fashioned stuff. Private daydreaming. He could not have designed a telling poster to save his life. Always fiddling with leaves and flowers. I asked him why once. He said he thought they were pretty. Can you believe it? He said, pretty? What, digestive and genital organs of plants? I said to him, and he had nothing to answer, silly quibbler. So notice that Tompkins devalues art. He reduces art to simply some sort of economic value. Its only purpose is as propaganda, as a way of creating a poster, either for political propaganda or to sell a product. And here's where I think there is some irony, because I've actually, even though Tompkins is a sort of a secular, unsympathetic character, I suspect that many of us have seen this same negative attitude towards art, even within the church. Churches can often be very good at posters, but not very good at inspirational posters, but not necessarily great at art. The value of a beautiful painting or of a beautiful photograph is reduced to some inspirational message that we put below it, as though the colors and the textures and the imagery and the framing of the the framing of the photograph or the painting were irrelevant. All that mattered was the message. When the church does that, the church has really taken a secular view of art and not a Christian view of art, which values the creativity itself. So there's the background. We can now jump to the community part, and this is really the important but shorter part of the talk. But I think it was important that we have this background before getting there. There's one point in this story early on where Niggle comes into a studio and he's looking at his painting. And it says, it seemed to him wholly unsatisfactory and yet very lovely. The only really beautiful picture in the world. What he would have liked at that moment, and would have been to see himself walk in, slap him on the back and say with obvious sincerity, absolutely magnificent. I see exactly what you're getting at. Do get on with it and don't bother about anything else. We will arrange for a public pension so that you need not. Um, Tolkien was actually pretty humorous. I think those of you who have read The Hobbit get a sense of his humor. And I think there's a lot of humor in this moment. You can imagine Tolkien walking into a room and seeing himself at work and patting himself in the back and imagining getting some pension that would enable him to spend the rest of his life doing creative work, writing his stories. But there's actually a deeper point in here. Because we live in a society that doesn't often value art, and often within a church culture that doesn't value art, we say, well, what can the Christian community do to cultivate art, to support its artists, to nourish its artists? What sort of soil will allow creativity and creative art to grow? And, I think one answer would be actually support the artist by valuing their work. And there's a sense in which a sort of financial support would be meaningful. In the same way that we value teachers, or I wish our culture valued teachers more. I think we can actually argue our culture doesn't value teachers nearly enough, or pastors and preachers nearly enough. But at least we see that they get some salary, some pay, because we say education and preaching and teaching and pastoring are important things. One way to value and nurture and encourage your art to the artists in your community would be to buy their artwork, to support them financially so that they actually have the time to devote to art. So often we do the opposite. What we do is we ask our artists to donate pieces. Would you please give a painting to to the church, or will you please give a painting to this auction to raise money for something? Putting more demands on the artist without actually supporting them. So a very simple way. Do you want to nurture? Do you want to support? Do you want to show a responsibility to the artist? Support them financially by making it more possible for the artist to devote the time they need to their art, rather than to some other job, or rather than to marketing their work. As an author, and having a lot of author friends, I don't know any of my writer friends who got into writing because we love publicizing our own work. None of us love advertising things. We love to write. And anytime, any hour we spend having to promote or advertise work is an hour that's not spent actually doing the work. Another way that the Christian community can support the artist, can nurture the artist, can cultivate art and creativity is by encouraging it and seeking to understand it. Again, keep in mind that this character Parish is a neighbor of Niggle's, but it is not a randomly chosen proper noun. There's no question in my mind that Tolkien, in an allegorical sense, uses the character Parish to represent this church community or this Christian community. And there's a moment again early in the story when Parish looked at Niggle's garden, which was often, he saw mostly weeds. And when he looked at Niggle's pictures, which was seldom, he saw only green and gray patches and black lines, which seemed to him nonsensical. And maybe some of you have looked at a painting or a photograph or listened to a poem or looked at a dance and felt the same way. All you saw were green and gray patches and black lines, and they seemed nonsensical. Parish did not mind mentioning the weeds in neighborly duty, but he refrained from giving any opinion of the pictures. He thought that this was very kind and did not realize that even if it was kind, it was not kind enough. Help with the weeds and perhaps praise for the picture would have been better. I'm not sure this needs any explanation at all. I think it's a wonderful example of what the Christian community can do to support the artist, or rather it's an example of how not to be supportive, and through that example of how not to be supportive, and it's an encouragement of what we can do to support our artist. Encouragement, but also an effort to understand the art, an effort to invest our time and our energy into making sense out of the picture. to make sense out of the poem or the dance. And that doesn't mean reducing the poem or the dance to some abstract meaning. It may mean just enjoying or appreciating the lines and the colors and the textures and the movement, to appreciating the art as art, to enter into the art of the artist, into the community, is one of the most important ways that we can nurture and support those artists. There's a point late in the story when the great shepherd more or less explicitly states this to Parish. When Parish and Niggle finally get together at the end of the story, and Parish is able to see Niggle's real tree and says, wow, I never knew, I never knew he painted something like this. I never knew that his tree had such meaning and such beauty. And the shepherd, the great shepherd, says to Parish, he tried to tell you long ago, but you would not look. He had only got canvas and paint in those days, and you wanted to mend your roof with them. This is what you and your wife used to call Niggle's nonsense, or that daubing. But it did not look like this then, not real, said Parish. No, it was only a glimpse then, said the man, but you might have caught the glimpse if you had ever thought it worthwhile to try. Make it worthwhile to try. Catch a glimpse of the art of those in your community. And I'm going to use the term art here very broadly because we are all creative in so many different ways. Not all of us express our creativity in art in the way that our culture understands art, but we do all express creativity because we are all made to be creative. For some of us, that creativity is expressed in teaching, in parenting, in cooking and making a worthwhile meal, and hospitality. Some of those other ways that we express creativity, I think maybe it's easier for people to understand. Sometimes the expression of creativity in art is harder to understand. Work to catch a glimpse of it. Make it worth your while to try. We could turn now to end with not the responsibility of Christian community to the artist, but the responsibility of the artist to Christian community. Or again, what is the role of the artist within Christian community to nurture or cultivate art and creativity? Let's get back to what that second voice said about Niggle. He was a painter by nature. He took a great deal of pains with leaves just for their own sake. Here's what I would say to those of you who are artists. Make your art well. Take pains to paint your leaves well. Produce good art. Develop your craft. Become the best poet that you can be, or the best painter you can be, or the best sculptor, or the best photographer, or the best fiction writer that you can be. Develop your craft. Earlier, I suggested that the Christian church, Christian community ought to try to support the artists within their community, including financially. But you know what I would say to the artist? Don't expect someone to buy your painting merely because you are in the same church. Don't expect someone to buy your paintings or buy your poems, simply because you're claiming to be a Christian. Paint well. Write excellent poems or songs. Make beautiful sculptures. Invest in the time and the craft to do that well. Should the church support its artists? Yes, I think the church should. But the artist really needs to invest and cultivate their own craft as well as they can. And that's one of the best ways to cultivate art in the community around them, is by showing what excellent art looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like. I think it would be great if churches hung paintings and photographs from its artists and read poems from its poets, not inspirational posters, but real art. Not things that needed to be justified or reduced to tidy little sayings on the bottom, but real paintings. I believe this. But for this to happen, the artists need to invest their gifts and time to make excellent work that's worth hanging in a church sanctuary or in the entry to a church. If you're a sculptor, a painter, or a poet, or a dancer, take delight in the loving act, even if it feels humbling to you to explain to your Christian sisters and brothers how they can look at a sculpture or a painting or read a poem or view a dance. There's often arrogance among artists who don't want to sit and explain their work, who feel like they're above having to explain it. Earlier we read how Parish never strove to try to understand Niggle's paintings. But Niggle also has to confess. He says, I did not give you much chance. I never tried to explain. I used to call you old earth grubber, which is another way of saying this, kind of pointing out to the sometimes pride or arrogance of artists who are disdainful of the non-artist. If you want your fellow members of your community to appreciate your art, to invest in your art, take the time. Don't be too proud to help someone explain, how do you look at a painting? How do you look at a photograph? What does it mean to read a poem? How do you read a poem well? And a last point, and we'll end here, final slide. I think what the artist has to keep in mind is ultimately those in your Christian community are your neighbors. We could say we could talk about the artist in the Christian community, but what we're really talking about is the Christian and the neighbor. The artist has the same responsibility to their neighbor as any Christian has to any neighbor. Early in the story, or in the middle of the story, when Niggle is taken away from his painting to the workhouse, to the poorhouse, the inspector says, there has been a flood in the valley and many families are homeless. You should have helped your neighbor to make temporary repairs and prevent the damage from getting more costly, to mend the necessary. That is the law. There's plenty of material here: canvas, wood, waterproof paint. In other words, I would love it if the church and Christian community help support the artist and even help support them financially to empower them to spend time in the art. But for the artist, there can never be an excuse. You can never say, my art is too important to care about my neighbor. When the first and second voice are, in a sense, judging Niggle in the story, the second voice in his defense says there's no note in the records of his pretending, even to himself, that his painting excused his neglect of things ordered by the law. To which the first voice responds, then he should not have neglected so many. And a final note to end. It's interesting and not unimportant that the story Leaf by Niggle repeatedly uses the term neighbor and refers to Parish as his neighbor. Parish was Niggle's neighbor, a man with a lame leg, his neighbor, his only real neighbor, so often in trouble and need of help. Maybe the most important thing we can do to cultivate creativity is simply beginning to learn to love each other, whoever we are, whatever our gifts are, and whatever our needs are, as our neighbors, and to love our neighbor as ourself. For the artist, your art can never be too important, can never be an excuse to not love one another, to not love each other. And I'm going to end it there. I actually have not kept track of, I can't see you all, but it looks like I actually ended about what I wanted to, with some time maybe for questions and answers. I'll let you decide, but thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We do have a few minutes before our coffee break. If anyone has a question you'd like to ask, following up on Dr. Dickerson's wonderful talk on Tolkien's short story. Since he can't see the room, I'll be the conduit.
Yeah, I'll have to trust you to relay questions on to me if I can't hear them.
I could kick us off, I guess. Matthew, could you tell us what you see as if the Christian community has a role in cultivating artistic creativity in the church? Is there a particular special function of the family in doing that?
So I'll repeat the question.
Yes. No,
The Christian community has a role, as you argue. Is there a more particular role in cultivating creativity for the Christian family?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, one answer to that is the Christian family is part of the Christian community in microcosm. So I think everything we said about Christian community would apply to the Christian family. But I think there's so much extra time that a family has together, so much intimacy that doesn't necessarily exist more broadly in a very wide Christian community. So there's opportunities that you have. So one of the things I think I would say to parents is to encourage time, to give time to children, to kids at all ages, that is unscheduled time to simply be creative. Our lives are so heavily scheduled, and I just see it as endemic in our culture, as pandemic in our culture, to use a more contemporary word, that we are so overscheduled as adults and as kids, and that doesn't leave much time for creativity, for just sitting and exploring, for our brains to be free. That would be part of my answer, and maybe the most important part. But of course, what you value as a family also are values that our kids pick up on, that families pick up on. I think, one of the most important things that we can do is to share art with families. So whether that means reading stories together as family, reading poems together as family, having paintings in your house, hanging in your house, talking about art, talking about movies, I think are all really valuable endeavors. We have an entertainment and sports saturated culture. And I think if typical families invested a fraction of the time we invest in, over-programmed sports and television, into spending time together around some form of art, without even having to explicitly teach lessons about it, we would be spurring on the imagination. We would be feeding or cultivating the imagination that would be raising up artists. And we would also be showing through our examples that art matters.